Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Air Force Association's annual Aerospace Cyber Conference and Trade Show outside Washington, D.C., the #1 gathering of U.S. Air Force leaders from around the world here on the 72nd birthday of the United States Air Force. Our coverage here is sponsored by L3 Harris and Leonardo DRS, and it's our positive honor to have the commander of Pacific Air Forces, General C.Q. Brown, who's joining us here. Sir, thanks very much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Vago. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, particularly on the 72nd birthday of our Air Force.
Yeah, outstanding, great milestone, and we've been honored to be able to talk to other very key commanders as well. We talked to Cobra Harigan in terms of some of the challenges that you two share in common with great power adversaries. We talked to Mobile Holmes and talked a little bit about that combat generation and some of the thinking there. I'm going to go to the Pacific Theater. You had a very thought-provoking briefing with reporters just now. Talk to us about the Chinese capabilities or the capabilities across the region, whether it's from North Korea or the Russians. I mean, obviously Russia and North Korea are also very important players in the region. What are the most worrisome capabilities out there that you're building a force to counter, contain, and deter?
The biggest thing I'm concerned about is missiles, whether it be ballistic missiles, maneuvering missiles, cruise missiles. And so it's really how do we defend ourselves against those, whether it be a system or via our tactics. And part of our tactics is agile combat deployment. It's really to be agile, to be not to disperse just on an airfield, but disperse across the region in order to make it more complicated for our adversary.
As you look in the theater, you've driven home the point repeatedly that this is a time for extreme innovation, operational innovation, technological innovation. I mean, if you look at somebody who has range, precision, area denial capabilities, it makes it worrisome, particularly if you look at DF-21, DF-26, and the layering of capabilities the Chinese have. And you talked about a whole variety of things, whether one-man weapons trucks that have, unmanned weapons trucks that have a one-way. Talk to us about how you think we need to think fundamentally differently in terms of how we do the job, because as our tendency is to think of mass, to think of heavy, think about long supply trains, and what you're talking about, and exquisite systems, and what you're talking about is turning that model completely on its head.
Exactly. So really looking at the concept, what we need to do. We need to be lighter, leaner, create confusion for our adversary, make it more challenging for them, decrease their confidence. And the ways we do that is not maybe the ways we've done it in the past. And so that's the neat part about being here with the industry here, is to talk about the concept of the things we need and then allow them to go work the innovation pieces. And that's why I'm a big fan of Dr. Roper. How do you actually just lay out what the problem is and then let industry go help us solve it versus trying to solve it in the traditional way?
And why, the chief mentioned this, right? I mean, there's a tendency of thinking about China's anti-access area denial capabilities, those things designed to push the U.S. and allied forces as far away from their shores as possible so that they can exert influence in what they see to be their zone that happens to be home to a lot of some of America's closest allies. Why do you see that as not a dome, but much more of a Swiss cheese construct?
Well, I think any defensive system has some level of vulnerability. And the more we understand those vulnerabilities, that creates that kind of Swiss cheese model that the chief talked about. And so part of that is how do we bring all these different parts together and then understand where those vulnerabilities lie, and then how we are able to take advantage of those vulnerabilities with the capabilities that we do have, and really to complicate things for the adversary as we go in.
In terms of the Chinese strike systems, right? I mean, we're no longer under an INF regime, so the United States can, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, that allows the United States to build longer range conventional systems. China was never a party to that, so it has these vast reservoirs of relatively inexpensive systems that can reach out and touch you. We're working to grow the length of our arms, but the old parable is it doesn't matter if your arms go from 3 to 6 feet, that's a really big gain. If the other guy's got 8-foot arms, you have a little bit of a challenge. What are some of the ways you can extend your arms to be able to operate in this space and thereby send a pretty important deterrent signal to the adversary, who may at some point miscalculate because he thinks, well, look, I've got a lot of throw weight, I can throw a lot of stuff at these guys at a lot of different places that'll complicate the U.S. ability to respond in the event of a crisis?
I look at it as a two-sided coin. I mean, the one aspect of this is not only the long-range systems that I might acquire, but it's the long-range kill chain with a good ISR system to do that. And I really look at it more as a kill web. So I'm able to get information through different means to actually drive ourselves to get to a targetable solution very quickly. At the same time, what I do is confuse my adversary by having counter C4 ISR systems that increase their miss distance, increase their confusion, and makes their targeting solutions much more difficult. So I've got to be able to do both.
Do you have the degree of confidence in the reliability? If you look at the multi-domain operations concept, it is brilliant in terms of stitching all of these capabilities together. Talking earlier in terms of, having discussed at the time the vision with Buzz Mosley as he was coming up with the whole grid and how to think about a John Jumper. I mean, it's a vision, as Chief Goldfein said, it is the vision of those leaders that we're living with today, and he hopes to leave an Air Force that the 24th Chief of Staff of the Air Force will be able to use. Do you have a high degree of confidence that the complexity, that these networks are going to have that kind of surety if you need them in a combat environment, whether through brute force, cyber, or spoofing, or jamming?
I do, and I think part of the things I really do think about is, we're going to be in a contested environment. We almost need to plan and build our systems for a contested environment and be surprised when everything's connected and be somewhat suspect. Right. Because if we plan for perfect and working the contested environment as a contingency, that's backwards to me. And so really what I'm seeing with our industry partners, I'm hearing a lot of positive communications from them on the concept that we've been talking about and how they're offering up options for us to invest in the future. So I'm pretty heartened by what I'm seeing. And I think we're all going to kind of same way, same day in that regard. And it's going to make us more effective as a joint force.
It doesn't matter whether you call it adaptive basing or you call it agile combat operations, whatever you call it, I think there's an understanding, smaller units constantly moving around in part because of an adversary who can strike any sort of fixed installation. How is that going to work? Because checkered flag during the Cold War experienced and experimented with that, but now your logistical hubs are very vulnerable as well, right? You have to compress that speed in a hypersonic environment to very, very short notice. How are you going to do this and do it right when the logistics have to move with the airplanes on what could be a very prolonged, consistent, long-standing shell game, if you will?
Well, I think the concept, for the PACAF strikes, it's evolved a bit. And what I've really looked at is the amount of lift that's required, amount of tankers required in order to use the concept the way it was originally designed, where you're moving ahead inside of a timeline of when you think the next strike's going to be. I don't know that we have enough lift to do that. But what I know we can do is actually spread out a bit more, be lighter, leaner, more agile at different locations with smaller footprints, so you have less at risk at particular locations. And by having a number of locations, the more locations I have out there, the more locations our adversary has to think about. It doesn't mean I'm operating at each one of them all the time, but if I can bounce around periodically and give myself options, and it creates confusion for the adversary, that helps me to help defend ourselves a bit better.
We're in an innovative time, but one of the maxims of warfare, right, is lighten your logistical footprint. During the Cold War, we went to common equipment, common standards in order to try to do that. In this environment, do we need to rethink how we're developing systems to reduce the spare parts content and the supportability and logistics requirement? Because ultimately there are lives tied to each one of those C-130 or transport flights that's going to be resupplying it.
Well, that's why I think pre-positioning is going to be important in how we do some of this. And then having a good understanding of where the common use items are. For example, as you look at our partners getting F-35s, understanding what the common F-35 parts you have. I think one thing that's common across all the joint components is fuel and food and weapons to an extent. And so understanding that capability and where we place that and how we as a joint team work together. Even a conversation of, do you have a joint logistics commander who's paying attention to all this with all the moving parts? Because that, to me, conceptually, or a logistics common operational picture, those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about, because it's going to be a completely different fight from what we've done in the past 20 plus years. And it's really going to drive us to think a bit differently, and we can't be stuck in the old paradigm.
One of the innovative things you said is that if you have a lot of 20-foot cargo containers all over the place and some of them contain weapons, you've presented a very, very big challenge. Is that part of the economical way to do this in terms of how you pre-position all sorts of capability in all sorts of places that look mundane and from a deception standpoint end up working in your favor?
I think it's a bit of both. To give us options, there is a bit of deception there, and I would also say it's kind of a certain things you show your hand, make them wonder, and then go quiet on. But it gives you options and flexibility where if every 20-foot container could be a weapon system, or some of them may not be. And we got to make sure that we use those kind of opportunities to help ourselves out, to make sure we maintain the advantage that we already have.
how are you coordinating this with each of the other services, right? Because if everybody's shell gaming, and the Marines have been talking about this for some time, the Navy is talking about it, the Army certainly has been talking about it, at some point you end up having traffic jams and folks show up where they're not supposed to show up. What is the kind of macro level coordination, experimentation, and thinking you're doing with your counterparts across the region to make sure that all of these little details are thought through at the end of the day?
Well, we do it through our exercise program, and even our real-time exercise, where we're actually doing physical exercise in various countries, how we operate, but in our wargaming exercises as well, whether it's our Title 10 war games that the services do, or the exercises like Pacific Century that we do in Indo-PACOM. And we've used those as opportunities to work through these problems of how would we do this, knowing that we're going to want to be, as I say, eyeballing the same location with the same stash of fuel. How do we actually go through the process with our logistics community to ensure there's a good conversation? And I think we're getting there. Will it take some time? Yes, it will, because it's something new and different. But it's forcing everybody to think differently about how we do this, and I really do believe we're on a good path.
Talking about doing things differently, most air forces control missile defenses, air and missile defenses as well. In our system, the Army and the Navy are the air and missile defense providers for the entire joint force, predominantly the U.S. Army. But there is a concern that given the nature of the threat, the distances involved, the distributed bases operations, distributed operations among bases across the region, that the Army and the Navy are going to have trouble providing those air and missile defenses, especially when an Air Force is on the move and trying to project force while on the move. And you addressed this question a little bit with reporters, does the United States Air Force need its own organic air and missile defenses to protect your bases, especially when you're on the move in a theater that's extraordinarily vast?
I think there's be a level of capability. And this is something that we'll have to talk throughout with the services in the joint community, because we're all looking at, for example, small UAS. And I think we've gotten down a pretty good path in that regard based on a lot of work that's gone on. I think the same level of conversation needs to continue to elevate as we start looking at the other weapon system capabilities that we have to defend against. And the Air Force is not the only one moving. So as you described, the Marine Corps is moving, the Army's looking at moving, the Navy will be looking at how they use distributed fuel points and those kinds of things. So we all got to think about how we defend these different locations, because we will all be interested in these various locations. And I think it'll drive a conversation that we have to have, not only on how we do the command and control, but future investments across the services, so that you have something more than just THAAD and Patriot, but you'll have the small U. And it's the way I describe it, from the fence line all the way up to hypersonics. I got to be able to, we collectively have to be able to protect ourselves for all that.
Do you feel, I have want to ask, follow up on something that Defense Secretary Esper said, but do you feel you have enough visibility and understanding what Chinese capabilities truly are? There are folks who think it's very unusual, for example, that the Chinese don't talk a lot about autonomous unmanned long-range systems. And there's sort of a void there, right? It's either they're not working on it because they think they've got enough people to do the mission, or that they may be holding something in reserve on that, which is somewhat more of a fear. Do you feel that you've got a good enough understanding, and the intelligence community has a good enough understanding of what the other, and are thinking creatively enough about what the other guy has and how he or she may be using them to help inform and shape what you're doing?
No, I think we have a pretty good understanding, but I will also tell you we don't know what we don't know. The way I look at it is there are probably some things we do not know about. And just like there's some things that ideally the Chinese don't know about us as well, or any one of our adversaries. And so we've got to be thinking about there'll be a mode or something that we did not expect if we ever went to conflict. And we got to be prepared for those. And then how do we think ahead of what might be the next thing, so we're already investing in it, or knowing what risk we incur for not investing, and we can buy down that risk, or look at how we mitigate what other threats that might be on the horizon that we haven't, they haven't reached or we haven't reached.
Allies, our partners, are absolutely critical across the region, whether north, south, and across. I mean, that's one of the greatest strengths the United States brings to it. We do rely on a lot of that forward capability that we augment in some cases, but at the end of the day, does the United States or the Pacific Air Forces need greater mass in that region? Do you need more airmen and more aircraft, more assets in more places to better support some of our allies? Because as Defense Secretary Esper said, there isn't a country in the region that doesn't privately confide in him. That look, the Chinese are really starting to play hardball with us to try to keep you guys out, to not forward base, right? We've gone to some nations in the region and asked to forward base some intermediate range weapons. Folks have not been as forthcoming on that, I think, as we would have liked. What do you think the right model has to be forward, and do you need more people and assets?
No, ideally, every command would go, give me more. But I think we do well with what we have. And the other thing I would tell you about our Air Force is that if there was a requirement, or tensions started to heat up, just like we've seen in every other contingency, we would very quickly bring in additional capability from across the Air Force and across the Joint Team. And so I think the key part for this is how we bring that in episodically so we can actually show how dynamic we are, but also to introduce parts of our Joint Team to the environment so they have a good understanding. So if they do deploy there, we're better postured to be able to fight and win.
How much of your bandwidth is about Russia, and how much of your bandwidth? So if you were going to say, your full bandwidth, how much is China, how much is North Korea, how much is Russia?
I'll tell you, the bulk of it is China, and partly because Korea. I've done 2 tours in Korea, and we've been doing Korea for a long time. I came in during the Cold War, so we spent a lot of time thinking about Russia. I don't know that we as a nation have spent as much time thinking about China. And so I spend a lot of time talking about it, thinking about it, and working with our partners and across the intelligence community and others, how do we raise our understanding, even across my own staff. So I'd say probably, 50, 60, 70% of my time is on PRC, time on North Korea, and then time on Russia as well.
And we should point out that at Kunsan, you were Wolfpack, also 8th Fighter Wing Commander. We just talked to T.C. Clark, Tad Clark, a little bit earlier in the day. Let me ask you, your AOR goes from the Arctic all the way to the Antarctic. You've talked a little bit about the challenges in both of those theaters. What's the right way to be thinking about those regions as part of the integrated whole in the Indo-Pacific, which is your big focus?
Well, NORCOM NORAD actually has the Arctic, but I have forces in Alaska to help support NORCOM NORAD. And so what I look at is the Arctic is a little bit of the precursor for the Antarctic. And the capabilities that we want to have in the Arctic are the same capabilities we want to have in the Antarctic. And so that's why I pay attention to it, to make sure that we fully understand what's happening in the Arctic and how we might respond in the Antarctic, ideally well after I'm gone. Partly because, right now, a lot of research goes on in the Antarctic. But as you start looking at this competition can happen in a number of different forms, and we want to make sure we are not caught by surprise.
Let me ask you about 2 of our critical allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, one the linchpin, the other the cornerstone, as it's long been said. Both of these countries are now at probably a low in many years in terms of the relationship between the 2 of them. Historically, Washington has played a very, very big arbitration role there to try to smooth over tensions. There are folks who are looking at and saying Washington could be doing more. I want to take that off the table, but specifically from the standpoint of a combat commander in the region who has to rely and work with these allies. Is the military relationship still strong? South Korea has cut the intelligence relationship. How strong is the military relationship? How are you working with both of these important nations to make sure that deterrent capability doesn't flag and that all the nations in the region are on the right side?
The military relations between both nations is still strong, and I have good engagements with both countries. I have 3 stars that are in both countries, 7th Air Force with General Wilsbach and 5th Air Force with General Snyder. And between the 3 of us, the dialogue we have, I feel pretty confident on the military relationship, realizing there's some diplomatic aspects they have to play out. But I feel pretty confident we're on the right track as far as maintaining and being able to continue to operate smoothly despite some of the friction.
And last weapon system question, F-35 going into service. There are those who sometimes say that the capabilities of the jet, that it's too short range, particularly from a Pacific standpoint, and that it's not as game-changing. You're the commander in the region. What is that airplane bringing to the equation, and is it as game-changing as some folks in leadership say it is?
I think it is game-changing. I really look at it not only as a weapons platform, but as a sensor. And you start talking about multi-domain operation, multi-domain command and control, what the F-35 and F-22s will be able to contribute to our situational awareness, and every sensor connected to every shooter. It's one of the linchpins to do this. And I think it opens the door to broaden our thinking about how we operate with all of our platforms. And so I'm happy that it's coming. I'm happy that we have a number of partners that are getting F-35 within the region, and it really does open up some opportunity for us.
Are you a little frustrated that KC-46 is coming in a little bit more slowly than it is?
I'll kind of leave that to General Miller, but I mean, it's a capability we want to have. And, we pay attention to it because of the distances we have within the region. But again, that's one of those where we got to think differently about how we might have to do fuel in the future in order to use various capabilities, because that'll be another commodity that everybody's going to be looking for is fuel. And we got to make sure we have a good understanding of how we're going to operate in that regard.
Sir, thanks very much. General C.Q. Brown, Commander of Pacific Air Forces, thanks so very much. Really appreciate you taking so much time with us, and hopefully we're going to see you at sunny Hickam or somewhere else in theater, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Vago. You're welcome to Hawaii at any time.